My grandfather sat forward in his chair, small and deliberate, like a man placing a chess piece on a board he'd been studying for decades. He looked at my parents, at the people the neighborhood bowed to, and then he looked straight at me. "Did you ever tell him about the trust?" he asked, voice steady, eyes mild but bright. "Or was that one of the things you thought you could keep for yourself?" For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then my father's jaw tightened the way it did when he calculated which words could do the most damage. My mother smiled a polite, brittle smile, and it failed to reach her eyes. My brother, the golden son, shifted his weight under the table, uncomfortable for reasons I would later understand weren't all his own. Around us the family laughed earlier, toast, clinking glass, the shallow small talk of people who sat together for years and only ever skimmed the surface of one another. It had been my 41st birthday dinner, the sort of late evening gathering that used to mean comfort. Tonight it felt like a stage. The question landed, simple as a pebble, and the wave it made was unlike anything I'd felt before. I had come to this table carrying a patience I'd turned into a habit, the habit of explaining, excusing, smoothing over. I had sat there for years allowing a narrative larger and louder than me to be told. Tonight, a small man, my grandfather, with his gentle hands and the quiet, uncompromising patience of the old, had placed a crack down the center of it. "You're being dramatic," my mother said, high and bright. "Grandpa, what are you talking about?" "About the trust," he repeated, and the words were calm, surgical, the one set up for him. My cheeks burned. I felt the world narrow to the set of faces around the table. My throat worked. The present clicked shut like a trap, something I'd kept inside for 25 years, a silence that had been folding over itself, making a nest, began to unravel. My mother tried to make a joke. It died at the edges. My father started to talk thinly about dates and misremembered attorneys and misfiled documents. Their eyes flicked to each other, requesting the choreography they'd performed for decades: denial, deflection, charm. But this time, there was another actor on stage with them. My grandfather's fingers were folded around an envelope. He placed it on the table with a softness that made the paper sound loud. "It isn't mine to keep," Grandpa said, "and it isn't yours to say it was lost." Everyone looked at the envelope. I could feel the blood in my ears. My brother's face drained color. I had never seen my father look like a man who realized he might have been caught in a lie. I had rehearsed the worst versions of this moment in private, the furious shout, the pleading, the desperate bargaining. What I hadn't imagined was how small the theater of power suddenly felt, how ordinary the ritual of family could become an execution chamber of honesty. My grandfather slid the envelope toward me. Inside were photocopied pages, a ledger, a bank statement with numbers that should have been mine, the trust set aside in my name when I'd been a child, and a series of transactions that described a life not given to me. The money had funded renovations in my parents' house, a lakefront summer home my parents told everyone was a surprise inheritance, flights to some Mediterranean retreat for my brother's education, tuition assistance for others, and lavish gifts whose tags still bore the echo of my name in the legal text of withdrawal from trust. The room pulsed as if someone had turned the lights on slowly so every small corner of the house would be exposed. My father's voice narrowed. My mother looked like she might disappear into the wallpaper. "You were supposed to have this money," I heard my grandfather say, "not to be told it was gone. You were a boy when your grandfather put this aside." I remember the day I took him to the bank. He asked me to set it up in your name so you'd have a start in the world, not to buy their comforts. They moved then, a practiced, panicked motion, words vomiting out. There was no real anger in them, only reflex. It was the language of cover-ups, accounting errors, miscommunication with lawyers. "You know how banks are. We thought you wanted independence." Their mouths were working more quickly than their composure. They expected the scene they'd always used to soak the room with enough noise that pity followed and everything arranged itself back into polite ruin. But the envelope was only the beginning. By the time my grandfather asked the one question that made my mother reach for a glass of water with trembling hands, "And why did the account show listed disbursements to Thomas?" something fundamental had shifted. My brother Thomas had been given opportunities, a private boarding school abroad, summer internships that paid for themselves and then some, a little apartment in the city where he could be independent, while I had been told to take menial jobs. He'd been polished. I had been the malleable, forgiving son who could be counted on not to make a scene. It would have been easy in that charged silence to erupt, to scream, to tear the tablecloth off, to force a confession under threat. But the revenge I wanted wasn't loud. It didn't belong to the people who still robbed and expected absolution. It was quiet and precise and used paper as an instrument of truth. It was the sort of revenge that arrived as a signature on a document, irrevocable, unemotional, clean. My grandfather smiled at me then, and it was a smile that belonged to the past as much as the present, a man who had loved me and remembered how to see me. He had been the last person in my family to believe I might be robbed and not know it. He had been the one who decided not to let that happen quietly anymore. That night the world was not the way it had been when I walked into the dining room. It had become instead a courtroom without a judge, where a life could be reclaimed with a single steady act. My grandfather had made that possible. He had placed the envelope in front of me like an offering, and with his quiet voice, invited me to stop letting them write the ending of my life. I looked at the documents. I felt the years of small betrayals and soft humiliations make sense in a new shape. The trust fund was more than money. It was a stolen future, a stolen ease, a composite of all the nights I'd tried to hide my hunger with jokes. It represented the version of me that the world had been asked to hold back. I had tried so long to prove myself to a family that never saw me. Now I had a way to stop proving anything at all. I didn't shout. I signed a form that night, not a declaration, but the quiet beginning of legal counsel, the first step toward reclaiming what the bank records clearly showed had been mine. The real confrontation would come later. But the seed was planted that night, truth exposed, reputation, fragile as it was, had been punctured. The rest would follow. The rest, as my grandfather would say in the weeks to come, was simply the work of writing paper. 2 weeks earlier, I had no idea that a single question could empty the room of pretense. I had thought my life was crowded with the usual compromises. Long shifts at the hospital where I worked as a wound care nurse, rent I could pay but never quite in advance, the gentle ache of deferred plans. I had a small apartment that smelled vaguely of disinfectant and rosemary. I had a coworker who doubled as my best friend, and I kept a few plants I sometimes remembered to water. I had learned to be grateful for the small things. My parents lived 2 towns over in the house I had grown up in. They had been the kind of people everyone from church smiled at, polite, generous at events, the pair who'd end a sentence with an affectionate tweak of someone's ear. They were in the social ledger of our neighborhood, the people who made the sort of donations that got framed and hung in the community center. They were to the outside world pillars. To the me who had been raised on the quiet edges of their largesse, they were selective. This was not a melodrama we had chosen actively. It was a slow architecture of choices. When I was young, my grandfather, a man with rough hands and a quiet tongue, had taken my father aside and asked about a future for me, his grandson. He had the money. He had held out the concept of a trust, a small but life-changing account for me. My parents had agreed at the time in the way people agree to what they think is convenient. "We'll make sure he has options," they'd said, while elsewhere options massaged their lives. As a child, I had watched them give Thomas the sort of attention you show a golden child. Thomas, my brother, who would later be the name that glowed on receipts, absorbed their adoration without effort. He had charm like a magnet. He had been the one who got the new guitar, the summer camps, the tutors with accents. I had been the one they nudged toward stability. "We think nursing would be so sensible for you," they'd say, brimming with practicality. I didn't hate their suggestions. I trusted their hands. I loved them. I also trusted whatever version of my life they allowed to exist. The dynamic grew like ivy. My parents told stories at dinner parties about sacrifice, about teaching kids to stand on their own. But their practice had a pattern: give lavishly to Thomas while asserting that I was the one who needed tough love. They called it independence. They told their friends I preferred plain rooms and a disciplined life. They spoke of my work ethic, the one I had earned as a young man learning to stitch wounds and stitch hopes back together. Their weapon, if you could call it that, wasn't venom. It was a slow-handed gaslighting, the soft implication that I owed them my gratitude for the things they had not actually given me. The weaponized guilt that suggested my dissatisfaction was ingratitude. "We sacrificed so you could have character," they would say. "We didn't want to coddle you." These were words practiced in the mirror until they sounded like virtue. I had long ago learned to be a peacemaker. It suited me. It nth dimensioned the friction of family into survivable pieces. I avoided confrontation the way one avoids potholes on a dark road. I believed, with that simple faith that a person accumulates like pennies, that if I was patient, the world would eventually even out. My grandfather, in contrast, was a man who loved with both hands and little show. He lived in a smaller house now, down the street from my parents, with a garden that smelled of oregano and lemon. He had taught me how to knead dough as a boy, and how a good watch needed cleaning. He was the only person in my family who would sometimes look at me as if he expected the world to answer my name. If I had to find the single filament that made the trap possible, it would be this. My parents had always expected that my appetite for fairness could be managed with enough storytelling. They measured the world with their narratives and expected all others to fit inside. The trust fund, a sum my grandfather had asked a bank to ring-fence for me, became a test, not a provision. It became, over the years, a way to say who was entitled to what. In those 2 weeks before the dinner, life moved with its usual rhythms. Night shifts at the hospital, a late coffee with Jenna, my coworker, where we laughed about the oddities of patients who treated their medical charts like a biography, and a few small text threads between my brother and me that were always overly brief, punctuated with emojis and the sort of cordial distance siblings learn early when they don't know how to be honest about money. Thomas sent a photo from some rooftop bar captioned "Killing It," and I sent back a thumbs up emoji. I had learned to let others inhabit their light. It was simpler. It was how I had kept the peace. Still, there were small moments that irritated me. A call from my mother, soft with concern, that ended with, "It must look odd you don't have your own home yet, dear." A birthday gift from my parents, a contribution toward new scrubs that came with a not-so-subtle anecdote about Thomas's new internship in Madrid. Things arranged themselves into a pattern named "Not Enough." Then a month before the dinner, an accidental email landed in my inbox. It was from a bank email list, a dry, administrative note, but the subject line read, "Trust Fund Disbursement Schedule Michael Revocable." I stared at the word Michael because that was not my name. My name was Elias. For a second I thought it was a glitch. But the body of the email included an account number and, at the bottom, a signature I recognized. An assistant's name tied to an attorney my grandfather had once used. I didn't understand it. I stored it in the back of my mind like a seed. I was trained to notice details at work, an anomalous rash, the slight pallor of anemia. I was also trained to file away things you didn't yet know how to handle, so I did. I didn't call my parents. I didn't storm into their living room. I let it sit, the way one lets winter water collect in a bucket, thinking perhaps it would evaporate. It didn't. Things rarely do when they are made of money and stories. The inciting incident arrived as a small, almost comic error. Thomas posted an image on social media, a sun-drenched terrace, the kind of photograph that tries to make travel look effortless. In the comments, a friend congratulated him on the grant that had funded his time in Barcelona. A grant. The word was casual, like a throwaway compliment, but it caught at something. I messaged Thomas, "Grant, since when do you get grants?" He sent a selfie back, sunglasses and that smirk that made people think he was perpetually amused. "Ah, you know, family support, Grandpa helped, chill man." I thought about writing back, "Grandpa helped, how?" But the more I considered it, the more the pieces I had stored in the back of my mind, the email subject line, the oddness of my parents' small explanations, pooled into a suspicion. I started quietly to investigate. The investigation at first was a string of polite phone calls. I called the bank, playing the part of a curious grandson, just checking some family accounts. I said, and the bank's voice suggested forms to fill, verifications to provide. I also confided cautiously in my grandfather. He listened. He had been listening for decades. He didn't hurry me. He had the patience of a man who knew his own bones. "There's paperwork," he said once when I told him about the email. "They keep records. I'll call my attorney. We'll look." We did. I learned that there are many ways for a life to be redirected on paper. Trusts can be amended. Accounts can be transferred. Language can be written in ways that confuse children, misdirect heirs, and sanctify choices. My grandfather and I pulled a trail of public records. There was a business license in the name of a shell company that linked to my parents. There were renovation bills paid to contractors that matched numbers on account statements. There were tuition payments for a boarding school abroad with a name that matched Thomas's most recent posts. And then, faint like the last line of a ledger, there were withdrawals made under the line item "disbursement to beneficiary" with my name, or rather my name misspelled sometimes, or under the legal descriptor assigned years prior. These withdrawals did not end up in my bank account. When I quietly confronted my mother in a voice that tried to sound neutral, she offered the standard family responses: confusion, then denial, then charm. "We did this to teach you how to be independent," she said, touching my arm as if she believed she was offering comfort. "We didn't want to spoil you." There was a kind of martyrdom in their words. It smelled faintly of self-justification. My father, when I asked him directly, told me accounting complications and then suggested I speak with a lawyer if that was important. It was a phrasing that felt like both threat and dismissal. Do it yourself. So I gathered documents. I made copies. I listened to my grandfather tell stories about a day when money was less complicated and promises were simpler. He told me about walking my grandfather into a bank years ago and watching the teller nod as a trust was set up in my name. He remembered the paperwork clearly. Memory, for him, was a ledger as precise as any bank book. I hired an attorney. It felt strange to spend money I didn't have on the thing that would make me whole. But sometimes the only way to reclaim power was to exchange a little independence for someone who could navigate the legal thicket. My attorney, a woman named Celeste with a no-nonsense haircut and eyes that read like scanners, told me what I needed to hear without softening it. You have a case, but if you want this to be clean, you need documents, dates, proof. She taught me how to file motions that could access more banking information. She taught me how subpoenas worked. She explained how, once someone suspected truth, institutions were obliged to look deeper. The media we used were all quiet: letters, certified mail, court filings. There were no dramatic sting operations, no midnight confrontations. I wanted evidence. I wanted paper that would not be brushed off as an emotional exaggeration. I wanted the kind of proof that would be accepted in rooms where the world was sorted by signatures, not by feelings. And I wasn't the only one looking. My grandfather, with his steady presence, had become a quiet ally. He knew the networks: a retired banker, a neighbor who had once worked in municipal records, people who could point to deeds, trace the chain of custody of names on titles. He had a file folder that looked like the kind of thing a man collects when he knows an injustice and wants to be ready. When I finally confronted Thomas, speaking softly in the kitchen where he lingered between photos and takeout containers, he did what he always did best. He tried to make me feel small for asking. "I'm doing fine, Elias," he said. "You're always so intense." But then, in a moment that revealed less control than he had intended, he showed a text message to a friend that read, "Mom and Dad sorted a fund so I could study abroad. Totally blessed." It was the admission in plain English. When I asked him directly whether he'd ever been aware of a trust in my name, he paused. The pause felt like the slice in the film where the camera tilts and reveals what was hidden. "I thought Grandpa set up something for you." "Not sure," Thomas said, and his eyes flicked to the door as if practicing where to place his guilt later. I needed more than a brother's faltering honesty. I needed a public reckoning where their story could not be reconstructed in comfortable ways. So I made a plan that was part legal and part performance. I would let the truth become unavoidable, and it would happen at the one event I knew would gather everyone: my birthday. There is a strange power in procedural things: subpoenas, certified letters, the patient folding of paper. They behave like patience made visible. They are methodical. They take time. They are, in a way, a kind of meditation. I asked Celeste, my attorney, what a person like me could realistically expect. "Don't look for fireworks," she said. "Look for integrity. It's often quieter than you imagine, but when it lands with force." We built the case not as an act of spectacle, but as an act of inevitability. We requested copies of bank statements, line-item transaction records, contractor invoices, and tuition receipts. It was a paper trail that ran like a river through 2 decades. The numbers were stark, precise, and finally undeniable. Meanwhile, my grandfather arranged, with the old cunning of someone who had spent his life on the edges of public trust, to sit at the head of my birthday table. He called my parents and said nothing dramatic. He simply told them he would bring a few family papers to show me a little history. He invited everyone. His invitation was like a stone tossed in a pond, a small act that sent ripples outward. I practiced my voice in the mirror. I told myself what to say and what not to say. I rehearsed the sharpness of restraint. I would not let anger make me do something that could be used later as evidence of instability. I would not collapse the narrative into a screed. I would show what was true. On the morning of the dinner, I woke early. It was a crisp autumn day. The world smelled of wood smoke and something domestic and familiar. I dressed in a shirt that I liked, simple and clean. I didn't want theatrics. I wanted to show up as myself, steady, present, measured. My grandfather called me in the afternoon, his voice thinning only with kindness. "Leave it to me for now," he said. "I will ask the one question." "What question?" I asked. He laughed softly. "The one they will not expect. The one that will make them tell the truth or else make them look like they have been lying to grown men." I trusted him because he had always, in the small ways that matter, acted to make my life plausible. He had given me pocket money when I was a teenager, and once he'd signed a note that convinced a loan officer to forgive a late payment. He had taught me what it meant to stand where you were and insist on simple decency. If anyone could fashion a trap of civility, an elegant, dismantling question, it was him. The envelope he had prepared was not dramatic. It was a crisp, manila folder stamped with the bank's insignia and a copy of the trust declaration. Inside were bank reconciliations, the list of disbursements dating back 25 years, and a small notebook where my grandfather had made his own notes about the day the trust had been established. He had annotated dates and the name of the bank officer who'd handled the trust. He had recorded in his careful handwriting a note, "For Elias, for his start." He placed the folder in his pocket. He wore his old sports coat. He smelled faintly of bay rum and lemon soap. He insisted on driving so that he might arrive early and place everything exactly as he wished. He wanted the table arranged so he could, in the moment he chose, ask his question with the room already attentive. I arrived and the house was as it always had been, familiar framed photographs, the same painting by the fireplace, the knife block with the one missing third slot where a butter knife had once lodged. The scene contained everything homey and comfortable and a little false. I sat near the head of the table. We made small talk. The grandfather told some story about a neighborhood dog that had escaped. My father talked about a project at the country club. People smiled. The dinner wrapped itself in the habitual. I felt like a man located at the center of a slow-moving train that had finally built up enough speed to make its tracks visible. When my grandfather set the envelope on the table and asked the question, he didn't sound like a prosecutor. He sounded like a man who had watched enough suns set to know when a room needed cooling. His tone was mild. It landed harder than anything else might. My grandfather's question, the one he used as a trap, had a specificity that made the lie difficult to form. Why, he asked, with the softest of inflections, did the trust in Elias' name show disbursements to Thomas in the years 1999, 2006, and 2012? When he said the dates, he slid a photocopied bank statement across the table. It lay between a gravy boat and a bread plate like an interloper. For a second, all the domestic props of dinner, the smell of roast, the candlelight, felt absurd. Paper was now the most dramatic thing in the room. My parents reacted exactly as a well-rehearsed script taught them to. Surprise, then confusion, then a volley of "we didn't know." There must be a mistake, we thought. But the statements had names, amounts, transfers, and notations. There were checks made out to contractors and travel agencies. There were deposit slips and invoices. The handwriting in the ledger, my grandfather's marks, matched the dates he had mentioned. My father's voice began to sputter. "The bank will explain," he said. "There must be an accounting issue." But Celeste had already played her subtle part. She had requested quietly that the bank supply certified copies under a subpoena. She had them. These were not hearsay notes. These were certified documents with a stamp that meant an institution had affirmed the facts in their own ledger. At a point, the room slotted into the familiar human process of shame management. My mother tried to put on a brave face. "We didn't want to see you spoiled," she said, then faltered. "We wanted to protect you." Her hands were translucent with nervous energy. What my parents could not produce were receipts showing the trust's funds in my accounts or signatures indicating my consent to any transfer. What they did produce in defense was a litany of rationalizations. It was for family emergencies. We thought this would teach independence. It was meant for family needs. The problem with rationalizations in the face of a paper trail is that their poetry doesn't satisfy arithmetic. The checks said otherwise. The dates matched purchases of luxury items and school fees and travel. The ledger was unambiguous. I felt something odd and new in my chest. It was not triumph as I'd imagined, theatrical, sharp and loud, but an almost ritual relief. For 25 years I'd carried a quiet question, why my life had been the way it was in a family that proclaimed fairness. The evidence didn't bring joy. It brought instead a horrid clarity. Someone I loved had taken a resource intended for me and used it as a private ATM for their own comforts and priorities. The theft wasn't violent. It had been structural, routine, normalized across decades until it felt like the weather. But the facts were facts, and facts have an awkward ability to rearrange rooms. The moment my grandfather placed the certified copies on the table and uttered the names and dates and amounts, the trust my parents had worn like an amulet began to crumble. The family reputations, the framed certificates, shuddered. They had been living with a form of moral credit they had not earned. My grandfather's voice then took on the weight of an elder's verdict. "We set money aside for a boy who wasn't yet ready to be the world," he said slowly. "We did this because we believed his life might be different if he had a start." I remember taking him to the bank. I remember their promise. I remember the name on the account. My mother folded her hands and sounded small. "We thought you would be better off learning to fend for yourself," she said, and the sentence bent like a child explaining a bruise. "You used the funds for other things," my grandfather said, and said nothing more. That sentence hung like a finality. When the word used is said in a room filled with family, its accusatory simplicity can be the most collapse-inducing sound there is. My brother's face, previously easy and boyish, had an expression that I hadn't seen much, real guilt, the kind that is not performative. For once his voice came out honest but small. "They wanted me to have opportunities," he said. "They said that was what family was. I didn't know it was coming from Elias Trust." It was a light confession, not a rescue. The gravity of the moment was not saved by tears. There were no grand apologies, at least not in the theatrical sense. Apologies in that house had always been transactional. They expected forgiveness as a viable currency. But this night the currency needed to be legal as well as moral. Papers needed signatures. Accounts needed adjustments. Celeste had prepared for this. She handed a simple letter across the table, a preliminary demand for restitution and an offer to mediate. It was firm and procedural, the sort of thing designed to make legal compliance more appealing than a public, drawn-out battle. It asked for accounting, it asked for repayment schedules, and it left the door open to arbitration. It was the sort of instrument I had requested, quiet, irrevocable, capable of becoming louder if ignored. My parents protested. Their public facade had conditioned them to expect that public shame could be softened by a house full of friends and a well-timed story of "we were only trying to help." But the bank had stamped the ledger. The transactions were in black and white. Reputation has weight, but numbers have a sturdier one. As the evening wound down into the aftertaste of dessert, my grandfather reached across the table and squeezed my hand. He didn't speak. His eyes held everything that needed saying. Later, in the kitchen, after most of the guests had drifted away, he pulled me into a chair and said, "You do what's right. I will back you. They cannot rewrite that day at the bank." That night I slept oddly, not from adrenaline but from the heavy piece of a plan that was now in motion. The truth had been exposed in a place where it would be heard by people who mattered. The more I thought about it, the less victory felt like something done to someone, and the more it felt like the simple act of choosing to live in truth. Legal processes are not dramatic, they are marathon-like. They take time, signatures, and many small rooms in which polite people talk about compliance. There were hearings and mediation letters, a draft settlement, a few nights where my parents debated the exact wording of an apology because tone can be a legal strategy. At times it felt absurd, the reductive way litigation transforms human betrayals into line items. The public reckoning at dinner had been the catalyst. Afterward, the neighborhood gossip circulated like wind. The country club membership whispered. Friends who had once smiled at our parents now cleared their throats a little differently. Status is porous when facts make their way into paper with stamps. My parents resisted at first. They offered me token amounts and proffered stories about how they'd foolishly used family resources in times of need. They painted themselves as accidental beneficiaries of their own generosity, but numbers remained stubborn. The bank didn't care for theatrical arrogance, it cared for disagreements resolved with signatures. Perhaps the most painful aspect was the way the family tried to preserve normalcy while inside their house change had moved furniture. They suggested a family counseling, which I accepted warily, but mostly they tried to maintain the conversational rituals that had so long covered their choices. The differences were not merely material. There were months of small emotional consequences. My mother calling more often, but now with a careful tone. My father avoiding eye contact at holiday events. My brother oscillating between guilt and defensiveness. He had been the favored child practically his whole life. Suddenly, favor had been shown to be conditional, and he had to reckon with the fact that some of his privilege had been stolen from someone else. At one point, my brother tried to make a public admission on social media, a half-hearted apology masked by travel photos and a hint that we all make mistakes. It felt like a press release more than an apology, a way to navigate the public without paying the private cost. My grandfather, who refused to let performative contrition stand in for the real thing, advised him to speak to me directly, which he did one rainy afternoon. He sat across from me at a diner, stirred his coffee, and said, "I didn't know, brother, I'm sorry." I nodded. The words meant less than the actions that would follow them. Apologies are only bridges when they come with a pedestrian willingness to cross. In the months following, mediation produced a settlement. The bank agreed to redirect a portion of the misused funds back into an account designated for me. It would not give me back every dollar, partly because the funds had been spent and transformed into goods and tuition, irrevocable purchases of a life that had been lived with another's money. But it provided an amount that could, with care, buy me the opportunity my grandfather had hoped for: a down payment on a small house, an investment in a training program, and a nest to live in without the constant grinding worry for a while. I think the most unexpected aftermath was not legal but emotional. I had thought that reclaiming money would feel like being gifted a second chance. It was, but it was also a slow grief. Grief for the years I had walked under a narrative that claimed I didn't deserve certain things. Grief for the belief that loyalty to family always meant silence. Grief for being taught peacemaking as a survival skill rather than a choice, for thinking endurance was noble when it had been a cover for neglect. Therapy became part of this reclamation. I had always been wary of the therapist's office, of confessing to a stranger the things you had learned to hide. But I went because reclaiming money doesn't always heal the ways people trained you to shrink. Through those sessions, I learned to dismantle the old scripts, the ones that told me that independence meant doing without, the ones that equated my worth with my capacity to accept being treated as expendable. My grandfather came less often to the house after the case, partly because he had a stubborn discomfort with courtrooms, and partly because he had accomplished what he'd intended. He would call, though, and in his voice there was a kindled joy I hadn't expected. "You did not yell," he would say. "You did not burn the bridge, you simply cleaned it." There were complicated feelings about my parents. I wanted them to be humble because humility felt like a literal payment, the currency of repair. But humility is not a coin easily produced. My mother oscillated between soft contrition and defensiveness. My father retreated into patterns of avoidance. We had family counseling sessions where a therapist read scriptural patterns that we had all thought were unique to us. We learned to parse words that used to be weapons as potential threads for repair. It was slow. My brother and I eventually found a way to be honest with one another. It started with small things: an honest text about the awkwardness of Thanksgiving, a neutral conversation about money where neither of us performed absolution. He told me more than once that he'd been living under a set of expectations as absurd as they were burdensome. "I thought if I lived up to Dad's praise I'd earn respect," he told me once. "I never thought it would cost you your future." We didn't fix everything. There is no single moment where a wound is sutured and life goes back to normal, but there was a reconfiguration. Roles shifted. The mantle of favorite cracked. My family had to learn to sit with the fact that their narrative had been a story told at someone else's expense. A few months after the mediation, with the partial restitution in place and money redirected into accounts under my control, I did the one symbolic thing I had been saying I'd do for a long time. I bought a small house, a modest place with a leaky porch and a kitchen window that looked toward a maple tree. The down payment was enough because I had been patient and because my grandfather's careful accounting had returned some of what was mine. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't even particularly pretty. It was, however, mine. I turned the key in the lock the first evening as the sun threw long gold bars across the floor. The house smelled faintly of new paint and something old, like memory. For a second, I allowed myself something that felt dangerous: to rest. From time to time, I would sit on the porch steps and let the small noises of the neighborhood knit themselves into a kind of belonging. The house had thin walls and a patient radiator. It had a yard that needed work. It wasn't perfect, but it was independent, that word my parents had used like a threat, and it was less about severing and more about becoming legitimate in my own right. I used the money not to avenge but to anchor. I invested in a small course that allowed me to specialize in a medical area I had been quietly passionate about. I began to put aside enough to teach a young nurse what I'd learned. I started a small practice of wound care consultations for patients who couldn't easily travel. It was not dramatic, but it was an expansion of what I already had. It was the kind of quiet revenge that metamorphosed into the steady building of a life. There were times when resentment flared. There were nights where I thought about what could have been if the trust had been there all along. There were moments where I considered either cutting them off entirely or performing some elaborate social triumph. Instead, I wrote a letter to my parents, one that was less a plea and more an account. This is what happened, this is what I felt, this is what I hope. I asked for honest conversation. I asked for accountability. Some accountability came, some didn't. What did change was the way people saw me. Without drama and with the force of certified paper behind me, I found a dignity that didn't need their permission. I began to teach classes at the community center because I could. I began to take trips where I paid for my own plane ticket. I learned how not to minimize my needs. Therapy helped me reframe the story. It taught me that vindication is not necessarily about seeing them ruined. It's about the small daily acts that stitch your self-respect back into your life. Paying a bill on time from your own account, deciding not to answer a snide email, turning the key on a house that smells of your coffee. The money had been a tool. The real work was emotional, relearning that my boundaries mattered even if those I loved didn't always respect them. My grandfather came to visit often. He liked to sit by the window and watch the neighborhood go by. He loved the house in a way that made me feel seen. You didn't need to burn bridges, he said, eyes soft. You needed to stop renting yourself out. His small practicalities continue to matter. He taught me how to balance a simple ledger, and he liked to point out whether I'd paid my property tax on time. He died 2 years later peacefully with a scrawl of my name on his lips as he drifted. There was a grief that coursed through the family then, complicated and clean. In the months after his death, I realized the thing he'd given me more than money was the permission to ask for what I needed. My parents continued to live in their house, which I visited occasionally. The air between us had new dimensions. It was sometimes awkward, sometimes civil, sometimes honest. I never fully forgave them. Forgiveness, I learned, is not an obligation but a gift. I allowed them the possibility of repair because it was kinder to me to hold out that possibility than to let bitterness be my permanent companion. We talked less, but more honestly. Thomas and I moved toward a reconciliation of sorts. He began to pay me back in smaller ways and offer to help with a home repair, a check, a note. He tried to be better. He told me once in a text message without many emojis that he was in therapy and trying to learn to be honest. That didn't erase anything, but it is evidence of the long, slow work people do when confronted with corrupt choices. In public, the narrative shifted. The people who had once nodded politely at my parents looked at me differently. Maybe it was the house. Maybe it was the way I navigated myself. Maybe it was the quiet dignity of someone who had chosen truth. Whatever the reason, the world responded. There were no parades, only a more pedestrian but palpable respect. It has been years since that birthday dinner. The trust was not fully restored to its original form. Some money had changed hands irreversibly. No legal victory can unspend a plane ticket or recall a tuition check. But the restitution returned to me the most consequential thing, the right to decide my life without being beholden to the stories of others. My story is not a revenge fantasy. It is a story of reclaiming a future that had been quietly redirected. The justice I sought was quiet. It used documents, the law, and the steady, stubborn kindness of a grandfather who refused to be complicit. It did not end in fireworks. It ended with turning a key in a door and sitting on a porch with a cup of coffee and the unexceptional, miraculous knowledge that I was allowed to have a life that felt like mine. There are people who will read this and think, why not smash the table? Why be gentle in the face of theft? The answer I would give is this: noisy revenge builds monuments to anger. Quiet reclamation builds places to live in. Both may seem to achieve the same thing when the cameras flash, but only one leaves you with a house you voluntarily enter. In the weeks after the dinner, I learned to live inside a new ethic. Keep the small calm, hold the line, use paper if you must. There is dignity in insistence, even if it arrives via forms and not fists. There is power in refusing to make the hurt your only identity. When people ask me if I regret confronting my parents, I say no. The cost was real. The relational damage was real, but the cost of not confronting them would have been greater. Years of quiet diminishment, the acceptance that I was someone who could be robbed politely. The truth restored not only accounts, but the sense that I had agency. That is worth more than any fortune. The final scene I will give you, the one I like to return to in memory, is small. It was a late spring afternoon. I had been working on a proposal to teach a series at the community center. My house smelled faintly of coffee and lemon oil. I walked to the front door, the one I had turned the key in first years earlier. The maple tree outside had small green leaves. I turned the key now for the simple pleasure of hearing it click into place. I stepped inside to a quiet house, put my bag down, and breathed. It wasn't triumphant, it wasn't cinematic. It was domestic and therefore, to me, infinitely satisfying. I had earned the right to a life that was annotated with my name in the margin. I had done the boring work of law and therapy. I had chosen again and again to be ordinary in the way people are when they are living honestly. I opened a drawer and took out a simple envelope my grandfather had given me years earlier, the one that had held photocopies that night. I hadn't tossed it. I don't know why I kept it, perhaps because it was a talisman that contained the evidence of a truth I now owned, or perhaps because the paper itself had become, for me, a symbol. I set it gently on my shelf. The house felt right. I thought then of viewers like you. I thought of the people who come to stories because they want courage and because they hunger to see justice that is not loud for the sake of noise. I thought of the ones who had been taught to apologize for their needs. If you ever find yourself in a similar place where someone you love has used your future as their resource, know this: truth is a tool. The law is a tool. Time is sometimes an ally. The quiet choice to reclaim yourself does not require theatrics. It requires patience, clarity of evidence, and the willingness to ask for what is yours. This is the story I lived. It is both a caution and a guide. My grandfather's trap at the birthday dinner revealed what had happened, but the life I built afterward is the real answer. The money mattered because it opened a door. The real victory was learning not to let the story of my life be written by those who preferred a narrative of their own comfort. I don't claim to be a hero. I am, at best, a man who chose to accept the help of a grandfather who believed in him and the slow, bureaucratic power of certified paper. I am someone who learned to trust that asking for one's due is not selfish, it is self-respect. True strength isn't about lashing back or making scenes. True strength, I learned, is knowing when to stop letting them win. If you've ever had to protect your peace by walking away or by asking for what you were promised, you are not alone. If this story resonated with you, share it in the comments. Tell me, have you ever had to confront a family secret? What did you learn along the way? Subscribe for more stories about quiet courage and the strange, patient manufacturing.